morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Celeste Suart today for our What Can I Do with My PhD talk. So Celeste is the Patient Engagement Manager for the National Ataxia Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in the United States, focusing on supporting ataxia patients and fostering cutting-edge ataxia research. She completed her PhD in Biochemistry and Biomedical Sciences at McMaster University and a certificate in Knowledge Mobilization at the University of Guelph. Celeste will discuss how teaching and communication skills are incredibly valuable regardless of your career goal, and she will also share her work her experience transitioning from academia to charity work. So take it away, Celeste.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see, at least your names today. Like Haley said, my name's Celeste. We have a small group today from what I can see. So how this is going to go is I have some slides, give you some background on who I am, what I do, how I got here today, and then we have plenty of time at the end for questions if we want to chat things out. Just to kick things off, if you've read my blurb and came to this talk, you likely already know that I'm a full-time employee of the National Ataxia Foundation. But one of the things I get to say in front of presentations now is that any opinions expressed here are my own and are not necessarily representative of the National Ataxia Foundation. I'm speaking as an individual today. So like I said, here's a quick agenda for what we're going to go through. First, oftentimes I get questions about what patient engagement is, so we're going to do a quick crash course in that. We're going to chat a little bit more about what my job is specifically. We're going to touch on my education and career, quickly go over some advice and tips, and then again, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So in short, patient engagement is the process of supporting individuals to make informed and active decisions about their own health. There's a number of different definitions out there. This is the one I like the best, just because it focuses on supporting folks as opposed to telling them what to do or saying, here's X, Y, and Z, here are the things you need to do in order to live a healthy life. That's not what patient engagement is about. It's more so about giving folks the information they need and access to the information they need in order that they can become an active participant in their own healthcare management. There's a number of different frameworks out there, but I really like this review by Higgins et al. That compared across different mechanisms, different ways people describe patient engagement, and identified 4 key factors of what makes patient engagement activities. The first is personalization of information. You don't want to just give generic information that could apply to everyone. What patient engagement focuses on is helping customize information to someone's unique circumstances, be that health condition, environment, social cultural background, in order to make it easy for them to digest that information and apply it to their own context. So that personalization is key. The second component is access to care, research, and information. Oftentimes there's barriers in the way to folks accessing appropriate healthcare, participating in research, or even accessing information about their own conditions. So part of patient engagement is identifying barriers to access and dismantling those barriers. Additionally, patient engagement focuses on how it's phrased here is encouraging commitment to change over time. What patient engagement isn't is things like, those 30-day juice cleanses or one-shot things that you'll see online from slightly dubious sellers of you take this and everything's going to be fixed. That's not what patient engagement is. It's not a flash in the pan. We're trying to create incremental change over time that can be sustainable and integrated into someone's daily life. And last but not least, this 4th factor here is developing therapeutic alliances between patients, healthcare professionals, and researchers. You may have heard before the term patient-centered care or patient-focused care. This is elevating from this traditional dynamic that you often see in healthcare of sort of the sage on the stage when it comes to teaching, or the doctor who's giving all of the answers to the patient. It's changing that to more of a collaborative way to approach healthcare and making sure that patients have the tools and information they need in order to have the agency to participate within their own healthcare decisions and building these relationships in this ecosystem of research. So patient engagement can take many different forms. If you talk to patient engagement professionals, they will often give you vastly different answers on what they do for their job. Here's just a couple of different categories that are frequent amongst this career. So some patient engagement specialists focus heavily on education. So this could be things like webinars, info sheets, lay summaries, even designing courses for patients to take. So focusing on this transmission of information, either about a specific condition or learning how to navigate the healthcare systems, things like that. There's also folks who focus on what I like to call the general category of feedback. So this is giving feedback to researchers, to clinicians, to government, to pharmaceutical companies. And it can include things like setting up patient panels, advisory boards, doing surveys for patients, analyzing focus group data. So feedback is often a key role. Also, patient engagement professionals can focus on supporting activities. So this could be things like running support groups, answering questions one-on-one, or having Q&A sessions where there can be multiple folks who are attending at the same time, asking questions on similar topics. Additionally, some patient engagement folks heavily focus on advocacy. So these efforts can, again, be targeted at government officials, different pharmaceutical companies, academia, but really elevating the patient voice and helping them have the tools they need in order to advocate for themselves. And lastly, oftentimes activities will fall into this research category. So this involves helping folks get involved within research, so that participation component. It could be involving collaboration, so incorporating the patient voice from early on in the research design process in order to shape the track of what kinds of questions are being asked, as well as how data is being analyzed and then how data is being shared. And there's also patient engagement professionals who focus on communicating research. So we've done a study, but how do we get this information to the people who need it in order to make decisions about their own healthcare? So that's patient engagement at large. But what's patient engagement in my day-to-day life? So let me tell you a little bit about the work that I do. So like Haley said, I work for the National Ataxia Foundation. So we're based in the US. We are the largest international charity focusing on ataxia, which is a group of over 200 balance and movement disorders, which cause folks to lose their sense of balance and coordination over time. There are over 200 types of ataxia. However, there is a significant number of them which are genetic, and most of the genetic ones have shortened lifespan as a component. So that's something to consider. So we are one of the largest international charities in this area, but we are a fairly small organization compared to other groups. We have 18 staff members, 5 of which work remotely, such as myself. And we support patients and families and researchers and pharma. And our mission is to ensure that no one experiences ataxia alone until no one experiences ataxia, period. So that means helping the folks who are here today in order to live their best quality of life, as well as investing in the research of tomorrow, which will hopefully be able to give us better treatment options going forward. So across the company, there are 5 different departments. There's research, which focuses on anything to do with, as it says, research, clinical trials, genetic testing. That all falls within the research department. There's the program department, which focuses more on support groups, organizing different conferences and meetings. We have a development department, which is a fancy way of saying fundraising. We are a charity, so they're in charge of reaching out to donors, coordinating different efforts in order to have the money to keep the lights on, as well as invest in the research that we do. We have a communications department, which they make everything that we put forward look really good in terms of formatting, graphics, visuals, aesthetics, sending out email campaigns. They're fantastic. And then we have a finance department who make sure that all of our accounting is in order. So like Haley said, I'm the patient engagement manager. I fall within the research department. A lot of my work involves communicating research-related things. I report to the chief scientific officer of the National Ataxia Foundation. She's my direct boss and my manager. Right now, it's only me focusing on patient engagement. However, we've had a few discussions about hiring a few folks down the line who would then come underneath me, and then I would be managing them in order to figure out what's going on and provide patient engagement services to the National Ataxia Foundation and our partners. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, the best way to describe my job is that I connect people. Oftentimes there's people who need information or opinions or insights to a specific circumstance or a specific study, and they know they need this information and that it would be helpful, but they're not sure who to go to or even how to describe what they're looking for in an accurate way in order to search this up themselves. So a lot of what I do is being this connection point in terms of connecting patients with staff members, with our academic research partners, with clinicians we work with our pharmaceutical collaborators, or even with government agencies. So I'm the middleman, or middlewoman rather, for a lot of things in terms of helping things flow, both information and access to that information. More specifically, I have around 6 different activities in my portfolio, which describe the kind of work I do. The first is our Prepper Clinical Trials Education Series. So this is a multimodal education series focusing specifically on how clinical trials work with rare diseases and rare disorders. So this includes things like webinars, handouts, different courses that we are developing so that patients can learn more about the clinical trial process. So when there's a clinical trial that they're interested in, that they can make informed decisions about which ones they'd like to participate in. We also have an ataxia type webinar series that I help coordinate. So as I mentioned, there's over 200 different kinds of ataxia disorders. Our goal is to eventually have a webinar series on every single subtype. That's going to take us plenty of time, so I have a lot of work going forward. That's good. But giving folks a deep dive with some of the experts around the world about what's going on at the biological level, what's going on at the treatment level for different ataxia subtypes. We also have a knowledge translation publication called SCASource, for whom I am the managing editor of. If that's something you're interested in terms of science communication, knowledge translation, lay summary writing, we do have paid opportunities for folks, specifically focusing on topics relating to ataxia and neurodegenerative disease. I have my email at the end of this presentation, so if you're interested in that, feel free to send me a message. But helping to coordinate the logistics of that, so reaching out to volunteers, reaching out to patients in terms of what information they would like to learn more about so that it can be featured in that publication. I also help coordinate the different research opportunities. So this comes from 2 different sides, rather. We have different academic partners and pharmaceutical partners who want to run different clinical studies, research studies, and they need ataxia patient participants. So oftentimes they'll come to us in terms of asking, can you help with our recruitment? Can you help get the word out that we are recruiting patients for this study? So part of my job is reviewing their application, making sure that everything is above board in terms of ethics and that the research methodology is sound. And then if it meets our minimum internal standards for research study quality, then we put that out through our networks. But additionally, providing research opportunities or access to information about research opportunities through other means. So partnering with different patient registries, getting that information out to patients, sharing, because not everyone is going to come to us. We'd like it if they did, it would make my job easier, but not everyone's going to come to us when they are trying to recruit patients for ataxia research. So part of my job is keeping my finger on the pulse, seeing what is coming down the pipeline, what's available, and then sharing that information with our community members. I also help manage our brain donation program. So we currently have over 100 different brain samples from folks who with a variety of different ataxia subtypes and have, I think we just hit our 160th pre-plan is what we call it. So someone who has indicated that after they pass away, they would like to donate their brain to ataxia research. So I help manage the logistics on that program from an information side, an education side. What does that mean when you donate your brain? What are we going to do with it? What information can we glean from this? And chatting with folks if they have questions. This is a very deeply personal thing to do. And oftentimes folks have a lot of questions before they decide whether or not this is a good fit for themselves, as well as a good fit for their family. So part of my job is answering those questions. And lastly, I help coordinate putting together different patient panels and advisory boards. So oftentimes we have either patients who are like, I'd love to hear from different people who have more experience in this area about a new treatment or a new physical therapy or different experiences in clinical trials. So I'll put patient panels together for patients to hear. Oftentimes we have researchers or pharmaceutical collaborators who would like patient insight in terms of their experiences with different treatments or different clinical trial designs, and they want to put together an advisory board so they can hear the patient voice a little bit more for their research. So I help put those together as well. And then last but not least, I do what I like to call unofficially general science advice. So as one of two PhD folks who are in the National Ataxia Foundation, oftentimes I have my colleagues coming to me asking me clarification questions about fundamental science topics, just because it came up in a conversation they had with someone else, or there's a big breakthrough or approval by the FDA or rejection by the FDA, and they're not quite sure what this means, as a lot of them come more from communications or business backgrounds. So for general science advice, oftentimes I will get questions about the research process, clinical trial design, the fundamentals of ataxia biology. So oftentimes I am one of two people that these general questions come to, and it is one of my favorite parts of the job. So that's my portfolio of what happens overall that I'm responsible for. But honestly, my day-to-day looks very, very different one day to another. So just as an example, here's a couple of things that I'm doing this week. So first off, I'm preparing for a meeting with the FDA on Thursday to talk about the patient voice for a specific ataxia subtype. We're having a meeting with them where patients are going to be able to sit down one-on-one with workers at the FDA in terms to explain their condition and what they're hoping for in terms of what is coming down the pipeline for clinical trials. I'm also coordinating panelists for our industry partners on a specific modality of drug injection, and they want some patient feedback on that. So I am coordinating that panel. I'm reaching out to folks who've had that experience and seeing if they're interested in sharing their story. I'm also doing a lot of logistics around our ataxia type webinar series, reaching out to different experts from around the world in terms of if they're interested in participating in these webinar series, if they need any help preparing content, because oftentimes these experts are very comfortable speaking to an academic audience, but get a little bit intimidated when they are speaking to patients, either one-on-one or as a group. So I'm there to provide some support. I'm also developing the syllabus for our education series for clinical trial design for this fall, as well as for the winter. So I'm preparing content for that. I'm doing some administration work for our knowledge translation publication in terms of pairing up article topics with interested writers who have capacity at the time. And then I'm doing some writing myself. We're creating a new webpage for genetic testing for ataxia. So given my research background, I've been asked to help contribute to that. So I'll be doing some reading and writing this week in order to generate that new content. But so this varies, again, week to week, day to day, but I'd say if I have to average it out, about 30% of what I do involves education in some way, running webinars, teaching folks, answering questions, designing syllabi, things along the lines of that. 20% of my work are what I call science questions, whether that be from staff members internally or answering science questions with patients and family members one-on-one or in small groups or at support groups. Then I do a significant amount of writing, which I have been trained for with my PhD. About 15% of my work is administration, so coordinating other people in terms of inviting folks in to give talks, scheduling different things, that kind of administration work. About 10% of my time is reading, so staying up to date on the literature, keeping my thumb on the pulse about what kind of research is coming down the pipeline, what kinds of new treatments are coming down the pipeline. And then lastly, this category I call feedback. So projects that I am not directly involved with, but due to my training in patient engagement, knowledge translation, and or my scientific training background, oftentimes I'll be asked to review projects that other folks in the company are putting together in terms of getting feedback about what would be the best way to communicate this simply. Is this an accurate way to describe this new therapy or technique? Along the lines of that. So reviewing other people's work and providing feedback on it from a technical perspective. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I work remotely. So I work from home or remotely sometimes means home, sometimes means other places. There's a lot of flexibility when you work remote. So I'd say about 65% of the time I am working from Hamilton. I am in the same apartment that I was for grad school when I went to McMaster. But it's nice to have the flexibility. About 15% of the time I can travel to visit family, where I will work my usual 9 to 5. And then in the evenings, I'm able to be with family members and visit them. So a bit of a working vacation. And then there is a small in-person requirement for my particular position. So 15% of the time I'm in Minneapolis. That's where the headquarters for the National Ataxia Foundation is. And about 10% of the time I'm on the road at different conferences. So most recently I was in Vermont. I'm going to be in Orlando in the fall, Boston in the spring, and then we have a conference coming up in England, as well as one in Australia that they're going to be sending me to in order to network with different researchers, connect with different patient advocacy organizations, and stay up to date on the literature. And just because this was a bit of a boring slide, I wanted to include some pictures. So here's a picture of me in the airport at a godforsaken hour in the morning, just because I do fly a lot now in terms of going to different places. So there's a lot of pictures of me looking somewhat sleep deprived very early in the morning at Pearson Airport. And then here's pictures from my last quarterly meeting. Here's the National Ataxia Foundation team. We're all smiling. And then we went out to a baseball game afterwards for a bonding activity. So there's me at Target Field. But yeah, so there is a travel component to the work I do. But at this point, you're probably wondering, okay, that's fantastic, Celeste. Love to learn about your job, but how did you actually get there? So let's dive into that in terms of my education and background. So if we're going way back, we can start with undergrad. So I did my Bachelor of Health Science in Biomedical Discovery and Commercialization here at McMaster. And I think it is there that I found that I really enjoyed being that connector person, so bridging two worlds. In this particular degree, these two worlds were laboratory research and, well, the commercialization, that industry component, most likely leaning into the business side of things. I also discovered in that degree that although I have a healthy respect for folks who have business expertise, that it wasn't exactly my cup of tea, which is part of the reason for my PhD studies. I decided to lean more into the science side of things as opposed to the business and finance, accounting side of things. But during my undergrad, I also got really interested in teaching in terms of how do we teach in education, in higher education, how do we train people? I had the opportunity to work with a teaching professor within the department in terms of getting more involved with educational research. So that kind of sparked that interest there. So after undergraduate, I stayed at McMaster. So I started my master's in biochemistry within this department. However, I did transfer to the PhD. I liked the lab research, decided to stick around for a little bit longer. Early on in my degree, I also founded a knowledge translation website specifically for ataxia research, SCASource, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. There was a lack of information about ataxia in general online, and there was a community need. So me and then a postdoc, now a professor at the University of Michigan, joined together to get that off the ground. And it's been 4 years since then, but that was a fundamental part of my early grad studies. I also started working as an educational development fellow at the McPherson Institute on campus, which, if you're unfamiliar with, is McMaster University's Teaching and Learning Center. I cannot say enough good things about the McPherson Institute. They provide a variety of resources and supports for instructors, as well as teaching assistants on campus. I highly recommend Googling them, seeing their website. They have a ton of resources for graduate students as well. But I started working there partially to help pay for my studies because, you know, paying rent and keeping the lights on is important. But it also really helped me lean into that education side of things, developing my skill set in terms of understanding what pedagogy is, understanding the science behind how we teach and what is effective teaching, what are best practices, what does that mean? So you can see here that research component within my laboratory studies, that communication component within the volunteering I was doing through SCASource, and that education component I was doing through the McPherson Institute. So this trend sort of continued into my late grad school in terms of I now was fully in the PhD program. At that time, I had been running SCASource for about 2-3 years, and I was self-taught in terms of how to communicate with the general public, with lay audiences. But I thought, okay, eventually I'm going to try to get hired for this skill set. It'd be helpful if I had some kind of credential that people could look at and be like, oh yeah, no, that's an accredited program. So I found out about the certificate in knowledge mobilization from the University of Guelph, which knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation are very similar things. They're different terminology based on if you're coming from a STEM background or a more social science humanities background. But I found out it's a 1-year program available online through the University of Guelph. I thought this is fantastic. It will reinforce some of the things I already know about lay summary writing and patient communication, but I'll be able to learn more and extend that knowledge. It was a really fantastic experience. If people have questions about that program, happy to chat it out. But I wanted to upskill, so I have a formal credential I could put on my CV when I was applying for jobs. I continued to work at the McPherson Institute. I was promoted to lead educational development fellow, so got a little bit more experience managing people. At the biggest point, I was one of the leads for a team of 15, which was a lot of people. It shrank. That was partially due to the pandemic. We need a lot of folks on deck in terms of helping instructors get their courses online and get their courses online quickly. But then after the pandemic, when that emergency situation subsided, the team shrunk back down to a very manageable 6, which is a lot better in terms of being able to have one-on-one time with folks and that face-to-face time. During this portion of my late grad school, I also led multiple education-focused studies, both at a local level as well as a local level as well as nationally, which gave me some really great experience with project management and coordination. Also during my late grad studies, I invested a little bit more in mental health training in terms of how to respond to folks in mental health crises. I had a close friend who had a mental health crisis, and I was very unprepared at the time, and it took me off guard how unprepared I was. And the way I usually respond to high stress situations is learning all about it that I can to be prepared for next time. So I invested in mental health first aid in order to, if I'm ever teaching someone or working with someone who's going through that again, I want to have the resources on hand in order to be able to help them out. And that it was also nice to have a credential to put on my CV to show people that I had that skill set and I invested my time in that. Then we get to the scary part, the job search. It's like, all right, I'm finishing up my PhD. I'm going to be on track to finish this year. Oh my goodness, what am I doing with my life? Good question. So I tried a bunch of different avenues that eventually led me to where I am today. So I did think about the traditional postdoc routes. That's, I think, one of the best or one of the most frequent things that people think of when they're in the PhD program. It's like, oh, I'll do a postdoc, I'll go into academia. I had figured out at that point that I liked the education side of things a little bit more than the bench side of things in terms of doing hands-on research. So I applied to different postdocs at a couple different universities in Canada, and I applied to postdoc funding. Fortunately, I did not get that funding, although in hindsight, I think it worked out pretty well. I'm very happy where I am now, but I got a number of rejections. So that kind of closed down the academic path for me, at least for now. I also had like a quarter life crisis right in the middle of writing my PhD thesis, thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? I don't know what's happening next. What am I good at? I'm good at grad school. I can do that. Let me reapply. So I applied to a few master's programs as a backup. And then when the postdoc funding fell through, I started actively looking for different STEM education research positions or teaching positions, as well as educational development positions. So helping educational development is helping instructors teach at their best. So teaching the teachers how to teach. So I had looked for and applied for a number of jobs. I was through the interview process. I received, during this time, I got an email from a colleague of mine who I'd met at a conference about 5 years ago, saying, hey, I now work for the National Ataxia Foundation. We're going to be hiring someone to be our new patient engagement manager. I think you'd be pretty good at that job. Here's the description that's going up at the end of the week. I think you should apply. That person is now my boss. But goes back to that networking component. I would have never known about this position if she hadn't given me the reach out. Maybe it would have come to me through my social media, but I really appreciated that heads up. And I think that just that email of, I think you'd be good at this. So I threw my hat in the ring there. And after 3 rounds of interviews with multiple different interviewees, I got the job at the National Ataxia Foundation, and the rest is history. So I had a couple other job offers at the time, but after weighing out what I wanted in terms of what I wanted my work-life balance to look like, that if I wanted to stay in Hamilton or move, or if I wanted to stay in Canada or move, as well as different salary factors, I ended up going with this one, and I couldn't be happier, honestly. Now, the question that I get frequently is, all right, so that's what you do, but how do you actually use your PhD training? You trained how to work in a lab. You're not working in a lab anymore. Was it just what what a waste, as it's phrased in that way. And I'd argue that it's not a waste. I use the education and learning that I found through my PhD on a daily basis of my job. One of the most obvious ones is content knowledge. I did my PhD focusing on ataxia research. I now work with an ataxia charity. That understanding of the fundamentals of what these conditions are, what they mean from a biological level up to a human perspective can be very, very valuable. To be fair though, I specialized in one subtype of ataxia, and I know that one like the back of my hand. That's one out of over 200. I'd say there's about 10 more that I know very, very well. And then I have varying degrees of knowledge of the other ones. So there has been some learning since then. But I slipped into this role a lot easier than folks who are not coming from an ataxia research background. To have that prior knowledge has been invaluable. I also got very comfortable with project management. So in the lab, I'm running multiple experiments at once for multiple different research outputs and goals. Being able to manage that has transferred over very well into my day-to-day basis because I'm managing multiple projects on the go. I have multiple balls in the air. So getting comfortable with that has been very valuable. Also, I got really good at evaluating research. What makes good research? What are good scientific controls? Does it matter if someone's gone to a research ethics board or an institutional review board? Things like that that you wouldn't necessarily pick up if you hadn't gone through the research and done primary research yourself. So when I'm asked to evaluate different research studies for their merits, I'm able to apply that knowledge very well. Again, that teaching skill component, I teach on a daily basis, whether that is on a one-on-one situation, which is a bit more like tutoring, or for groups of people. So those transferable skills have been invaluable. Going back to that communication, being able to communicate with different audiences. If you are trying to share information to a non-expert versus someone who is new to the field versus a PI who's been in it forever, you phrase your emails in different ways, or you talk and phrase your ideas in different ways. So being able to be comfortable communicating with folks with a variety of different background knowledge through my PhD has very much helped my current work environment now. As well as mentioning learning. I've gotten very comfortable at doing a crash course for myself on a specific topic and trying to familiarize myself with the information out there and finding that information, which is a key component to PhD studies. And I do that, again, on a daily basis. And last but not least, failing and uncertainty. Oftentimes in PhD, you can do everything right and the experiment still won't work. And for ataxia research, there's a lot of people doing everything right. They're crossing their T's, they're dotting their I's, they are asking good questions, and we're not making progress. That's not because they're failing, that's the research process. So being familiar with that, understanding the timelines of how research works, being able to communicate that with other folks, as people have really thanked me for that in terms of giving them that perspective. All right, just looking at the time here, I'll speed up a little bit. Here's just some advice and tips based on from what I've learned so that you can learn from my mistakes. First off, when you're exiting your PhD to go on the job hunt, I can't recommend more getting involved outside of the lab you are in. Now, don't get me wrong, your PhD studies and your projects, that needs to be your priority. That needs to be done. If you're not making progress there, you should be speaking with your supervisor to work something out in order to figure out what's going on. But those experiences outside of the lab, getting involved with different clubs and organizations, helping plan research seminars or research conferences, those tangible experiences are going to be what folks ask you about when you're going through the job interview process. I know that was entirely what interviewers focused on when I was going through the job search process and going through interviews. Another thing to ask yourself is when you're thinking about what kind of field you want to go into, think about what did you like most about your PhD? So a friend of mine, we both asked this ourselves, and what I liked most about my PhD was training the undergrad students in our lab and helping them discover new knowledge. So I'm like, oh, well, that has a lot to do with teaching. Maybe I should focus more on a teaching-focused career. For my friend, she really liked reading scientific papers and deconstructing arguments. Plot twist, she's in law school now. So trying to figure out what do you like most about your current training experience and try to find jobs or other training experiences that's a focus of. Additionally, try to make connections with folks and stay in touch. You never know who you're going to work with going forward. Like I said, I got my job because I met a random person at a conference in 2018, and we stayed in touch. And that person happened to end up getting hired by the National Ataxia Foundation. And when they were talking about, oh, we need someone for patient engagement and knowledge translation, she's like, oh, I know someone who might be a good fit. Let me send her this job application. So you never know who you're going to meet or who you can help out in your journey and who's going to help you out with yours. So when you go out to conferences, chat with people, make those connections, see how you can help each other and how you can help each other grow. Another thing is asking people about their job. So just attending this session is a really great start, getting to know what's out there. At the beginning of my PhD, I would have never considered any kind of career within the nonprofit sector. And I didn't really know how a laboratory-based PhD person could work in the nonprofit sector. So that has made a huge difference. And I had wished I had chatted with more people about what kind of work is out there and what they could do, kind of sped run that at the end of my PhD. So as you meet people who have cool jobs, ask them about it. People love to chat about the work they do. Additionally, update your LinkedIn. I know as researchers, oftentimes we don't use this as much, but folks within the business communication space heavily rely on LinkedIn in terms of networking, as well as searching out potential folks who they want to send information to about, hey, we are hiring someone for this position. I think you should apply. LinkedIn is a great networking tool. So if you're not already on there, would definitely recommend it. And lastly, if you're specifically trying to go into the nonprofit space, starting volunteering early, building relationships with nonprofits can be a very great start. You don't need to necessarily volunteer for the nonprofit that you are eventually going to work for. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. But just having volunteer experience on your resume to show that you're putting yourself out there, that you're interested in this kind of work can be super valuable in terms of putting yourself on the map and having something to talk about once you get to that job interview. So I've run a little bit over time. My apologies for that. But thank you so much for listening. Here's my email if you want to take it down. The slides are going to be made available later, so it will be on there as well. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Celeste. That was a fantastic talk. So informative, and I think you made everyone very excited about what you do. Now we'll open up the floor to questions. If people would like to put their questions directly in the chat, Celeste will be able to see them there, and we'll read them out to you and get you an answer. While we wait for the chat to pick up, Celeste, I guess I'll start off, and I want to ask you, what has been the biggest or best moment of your career so far?
Okay, so I did prepare a slide for this. So I had the opportunity back in March to put together a session on breakthroughs in ataxia research. So kind of an update on what's happened in the past, 3 or so years. That's been the last time since we had a major in-person meeting due to COVID. And I got to speak on a panel with, there's my boss, Lauren, there's me, there's my, this Haley McLaughlin, who I founded ScotSource with. You might recognize the guy in the middle. That is Bill Nye, the science guy. So I get to speak with him and be listed with him on a talk, which I've peaked early in my career. Nothing is going to top this. But it definitely was a huge, mind-blowing experience, especially since he had such significant insights in terms of the research experience, how research works, but also from the patient perspective. He comes from an ataxia family, so he was talking about his own experience and his family's experience participating in clinical trials. So this was definitely, again, I peaked early during my career. Everything's downhill from there, unless I get to work with him again, which I hope I do. I am seeing a couple of questions come through the chat, so I'm just going to stop screen sharing so I can actually see the chat a little bit better. Fantastic. So we have a question here. Do you have a sense of how many different organizations have similar positions to yours? Fantastic question. And honestly, one I didn't know the answer to until far after I started the job search on this. Again, I hadn't really heard about this kind of work during my PhD. So most medium to large size charities will have a patient engagement arm. Sometimes they're called different things in terms of patient engagement, volunteer engagement, community engagement. But oftentimes health-based charities will have a dedicated professional or professionals in terms of being able to reach out to patients, communicate complex information simply and directly. And that's just in the nonprofit space. More and more pharmaceutical companies and different industry members are having in-house patient communication teams or patient engagement teams. So one of my jobs at the National Ataxia Foundation is collaborating with my industry partners who set up things in-house in terms of, oh, well, we know how to run advisory board, we know how to run a patient panel, but we do not have the connections that you have. Could you help us reach out to the community members who have the best insight in terms of this particular lived experience? So it's not all nonprofit, there's pharmaceutical companies as well, but this is definitely a growing field, especially with the trend to involve patients and have that patient-centered care more focused at the center of healthcare right now. So that's that question. Moving on to the next one. What are some of the challenging aspects of your job? Another great question. I will categorize this into a couple different facets. So since for most forms of ataxia, they are fatal, and they are fatal fairly early in life. There's some where folks pass away in childhood, some in mid-adulthood, some in late adulthood, but passing early and of an incurable disease is incredibly sad and difficult. Oftentimes my job involves sitting with people in that discomfort because they have questions that sometimes we have answers to. Sometimes those answers we have are not fantastic, but oftentimes we don't have any answers whatsoever because we don't know enough yet. And that's hard. And sometimes people want the specifics and the details and understanding, and they want research studies. And sometimes they just want someone to sit with them on a Zoom call or a phone call and acknowledge that this just sucks and it's difficult. And I'm so sorry. And I wish there was something I can do. So there is that emotional labor component
I'm like
helping of my job. Oh, sorry, Haley. But there's that emotional component that I've spoken with other patient engagement leads at other organizations, and that is a part of it, which is why having some mental health training has been incredibly valuable, not only when I'm helping out other people, but helping out myself. So that's definitely one of the big things in terms of processing those feelings, not taking them home with me at the end of the day, especially someone who works from home. So having that separation, as it's good to sit with someone in those feelings, but you can't let them consume you. So there's definitely that component. Another thing is there can be a lot going on at once and things change very rapidly. So you are working with folks with multiple different timelines. So you have pharmaceutical companies who have plans spanning years in advance in terms of, oh, here's all the steps we're going to go through, and then things will change and suddenly they need different deliverables. You're working with government agencies who will set deadlines and then be extremely strict about them with very little flexibility. And then you're working with patient populations who would like answers yesterday, if possible. And you have all these competing different priorities in terms of trying to figure out, all right, what is a happy compromise that most people will agree with and find valuable? So managing those different expectations and also helping folks understand where other people are coming from. That's a big one. But I say those are the two biggest things, that emotional component, as well as trying to manage expectations, working with folks who have very different expectations of what timelines are, what deliverables are, and what progress is. And then just scrolling down, How did you find balancing your PhD research with knowledge mobilization certificate at Guelph, as well as working with McPherson and TAing? And I did also have to TA at the time. And I will say that I got better. So this, just to reiterate, this question is about time management. So I did multiple things during my PhD. How did I manage that? I will say I got better at it over time. And early on in my graduate studies, and especially during my undergrad, I would overextend myself because I would have a very hard time saying no to cool opportunities. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I can totally take that on. And then I would burn out very quickly. And then my body would be like, yeah, no, you're sleeping now. You're too exhausted. You're not going to be doing anything, which then would get things delayed. And then I'd be stressed. I'm sure that you can likely understand and empathize in terms of a lot of the different priorities you have during your PhD and trying to balance them. In terms of how I balanced it, or eventually did, I found out that I had to find a system that worked for me in terms of tracking things. So I personally I got a planner, and I was very intentional in terms of blocking off time for specific projects. It's like, all right, at this point, I'm going to be in the lab. I'm going to be doing tissue culture from this hour in the morning to this hour. Then I have this break to prepare for the tutorial I have coming up. So trying to block off my time visually, I found helped me particularly well. I know there's folks who use different apps in order to do that, but trying to see within a visual way, at least for me, what time there was during the day and what projects I had on the go was helpful. And that planning that out a couple of weeks in advance or a couple of months in advance for some of the longer term things, I was able to block off my time and see, all right, how much time do I actually have to work with, incorporating breaks there as well. So being able to figure out a system that worked for me in order to figure out what do I have on my plate, how much time is this going to take, was very helpful. And then also learning how to say no. I know later on in my PhD, I was a lot more comfortable saying, this seems like a fantastic opportunity and experience. I'm at capacity now. So I'd be happy to work with you again in the future if something comes up when things are lighter, but at the moment, I really can't take this on. So learning how to say no, and even when it's really something you want to do, but you know that another thing on your plate, you're just going to get overwhelmed, being able to turn things down was really, I don't want to say revolutionary, but it was for me, because I was just so used to saying yes to everything all the time. And now it's a lot more comfortable. And oftentimes to my job currently, I'll say, oh, I don't have capacity for this at the moment. Can we put this on someone else's project? Can I get looped in later? And my colleagues do appreciate having someone who is realistic with their capacity for workload. So that's a very roundabout answer, but to summarize, finding a planning system that works for you so you can understand what you have to do and how much time it's going to take, and learning how to say no. And just scrolling through, we have another question. Have you taken on any new projects that you are really excited that you can tell us about? That's a very good question. In terms of the ones that I can share publicly, the project I'm working on with the FDA is very exciting. This is a very rare opportunity. So the FDA has what they call patient listening sessions, which again are 90-minute one-on-one sessions where you can have a patient advocacy organization and different patient speakers chat with FDA staff members specifically about one disorder, one condition, what is daily life like, what are the symptoms, what would be most helpful in order to improve quality of life. These are extremely rarely granted. They only run about 4 to 5 a year. And we were able to get one for a specific subtype of ataxia called spinocerebellar ataxia type 3. So being able to work with my FDA colleagues, work with the patient panelists, hearing their stories, figuring out the best way to represent the diversity of experiences of the community. This is a disorder that affects thousands of people across the world. Even it's a rare condition, that's still a significant number. We have 90 minutes and 7 patient representatives. How do you coordinate that and try to explain the breadth of an experience through 7 perspectives? So being able to work on a regulatory project such as this so early on within my career has been absolutely amazing. So that's definitely a new project I've taken on. And then I would also say the brain donation project has been definitely something new. I didn't work with postmortem tissue during my PhD. I worked with live donor fibroblasts. So skin cells, they have a little punch biopsy that they can take from live donors. So I hadn't really worked with folks who had donated postmortem tissue, which is a completely different perspective. So we have some interesting things in this area. We're hoping to expand the brain donation program to more tissue, to include different tissue types, which is a very interesting conversation to try to have with someone, and also very personal. And I kind of like leaning into those areas. But there's evidence to suggest that collecting other tissue types in order to better understand how ataxia is presenting within periphery systems would be beneficial. So that's very intellectually interesting. We're going to be looking on how to better advertise the samples we have to different researchers. So there's that one coming down the pipeline. And I think those are the ones that I am able to publicly share at the moment. But honestly, I really love the work that I do. There is such a variety of things going on. There's never a boring moment. I don't think I could do a job where every day is the same thing and I'm always working on the same kind of work and performing the same activities. My brain will get kind of bored with it at times. So having so many different projects on the go and things coming into more focus, or, oh, the deadline's coming up, I'm going to put more time on this now, really works for me in terms of how my brain works and how I like to work. As when I am getting, when one type of activity such as writing is getting old, like, oh, and now we have to plan this new webinar series that's coming up. So if you're the kind of person who likes jumping between different activities, having a lot of things on the go, a role like this could fit you really well.
Okay, well, I think that's it for questions for now. Like Celeste mentioned, she's got her email that she's provided. Please feel free to reach out to her. I know that Celeste is very, very friendly, and she'd be more than happy to chat about things on her own time. So thank you so much for joining us today, Celeste. This was fantastic, and we wish you all the best at the National Ataxia Foundation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming today, and have a good rest of your day.